This is my Wedge Project by Colin Melissa. The first wedge I chose is aiming to improve fuel efficiency of automobiles by 100% in order to reduce carbon emissions. Cars and transportation account for 27% of the U.S.'s carbon emissions according to the EPA in 2013. As such, if we double the fuel efficiency of all the world's cars, not only would it be beneficial to drivers, but also the environment. Plus, the improvement is relatively cost efficient since fuel efficiency is already a component in many a car company's R&D program. The second wedge is looking to decrease emissions from heating, cooling, lighting, and electrical appliances. These particular things are prominent carbon producers within buildings, and if these emissions were to be cut by 25% in all existing and new buildings, this would significantly lower our overall carbon footprint. However, this option is rather expensive since existing infrastructure would have to be replaced in every single building, plus be added in new buildings. So people who build buildings would not like this option. Wedge number 3, efficiency electricity. This next wedge would be achieved by doubling the efficiency of electricity by which is currently created by coal-based systems. Whether this entails improving turbines or using different fuel cells, this particular strategy can improve emissions by quite a bit. This wedge is a feasible action since this particular procedure is not as arduous or expensive as the last one mentioned. The only problem that may arise is that new power plants would be more expensive to build and implement, which would make power plant building companies unhappy. Wedge number 4 I chose was CCS hydrogen. This wedge would entail creating hydrogen to replace as fuel in automobiles and heating systems. In order for this strategy to account for a wedge, hydrogen production would need to increase tenfold. This idea is particularly desirable since when hydrogen is burned, the only product is water. However, a large amount of the hydrogen produced comes from petroleum refinement, so carbon would need to be captured in order for this to be considered a wedge. Plus, almost no hydrogen infrastructure is in place for this wedge to happen, which makes this plan rather expensive. The next wedge entails switching from coal-generated power to natural gas-generated power in 1,400 power plants. Basically, this wedge would require us to ramp up our natural gas electricity production by 4 times the amount. This particular wedge wouldn't cost too much, however, current natural gas levels that are being extracted are about 1/10 of what would be needed to meet this strategy's demands. Overall, this is a pretty good option since natural gas has fewer carbon emissions than that of coal. However, it is still a non-renewable natural resource, which could present problems later on. The sixth wedge I chose is biofuels. This wedge has many benefits since it is a carbon-neutral way to fuel cars. It can be achieved by increasing the production of ethanol by 12 times the current production rate, with it being sustainable. Unfortunately, this particular option comes at the cost of land space that would have otherwise been used to grow food and other crops. This problem is ever present with population consistently rising, and the land constraint gets greater and greater as time passes. Solar electricity is my 7th wedge. Solar power is a fantastic way to reduce carbon emissions, since more than 30% of the United States carbon emissions come from the production of electricity. This particular wedge can be achieved by installing solar arrays in an area about the size of New Jersey. Plus, solar energy releases 0 emissions, making it an ideal way to produce electricity. However, the technology is pricey, which would make it difficult to implement. Plus, you can only harness the sun during the day when it is shining, which could also be seen as a drawback. My 8th and final wedge is nuclear electricity. Nuclear energy is a great way to cut carbon emissions, since, like I said in the last wedge, electricity production produces a great portion of the world's carbon release. Another really good thing about nuclear electricity is that it can produce lots and lots of energy. If the amount of nuclear power used today was tripled, with coal power plants becoming defunct, a wedge can be achieved. However, nuclear power does come at a cost. Not only is it rather expensive, but it can be incredibly dangerous. Nuclear meltdowns are always a big concern and could be disastrous. Despite that, if the proper precautions are taken, nuclear power is a feasible way to greatly cut out carbon footprint. That is the end of my wedge presentation.